Now joined in studio by Her Excellency Dana Ehrlich, the Israeli ambassador to Ireland. Ambassador, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Now, the latest chapter in the conflict between Palestinian people and Israel started with the attack on the Rock Festival, and we don't know how many thousand Hamas gunmen came into your country. But to put it in a context, if that were to happen in Ireland, just comparing the two populations, 800 Irish people would have died on that day. If you compare it to the United States in terms of population, 50,000 people would have died in the United States on that day. So I just wanted to lay that down as a marker so maybe our listeners can understand the extent of the shock in Israel at the extent of what occurred.
Yes, and as we've discussed earlier, it is as if people went into the electric picnic and just butchered and massacred the attendees of that innocent music festival. I'll just want to separate that we've seen a lot of violent cycles, we've seen a lot of operations, we've experienced, unfortunately, wars, terror attacks. This is nothing like it, and this is why we're separating. This is not part of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. This is a terror organization that is set to kill all Jewish and Israelis, and they will not stop, as we've seen.
Initially, when we saw the death toll, which was rising throughout the day, and it was already being compared to 9/11, but in numerical terms, for you, in terms of your population, it is far greater than 9/11.
It is far greater, but not just numbers-wise. In a sense, 9/11, and it was horrific act of terror. It was a one-day event that ended. And unfortunately, what we are experiencing are not just the horrors of October 7th, but we have 220 hostages in Gaza, and we have a constant barrage of rockets every day on Israel. The fighting has not stopped. So it was not a one-day event, but this is an ongoing war that Hamas started with Israel.
Now, the fact that they started, and we'll talk about what the motivation might have been, but at the retaliation by Israel, again, if you take the numbers game, if 5,000 people have died in the Gaza Strip on foot of the bombing by Israel of the Gaza Strip, that, in fact, numerically, if it were to happen to you, would be the equivalent of 20,000 people dying. So when is enough retaliation? When is enough in terms of extracting a price from Hamas and from the people of Gaza?
I'd like to separate that question to a few parts, if I may. One is the fact that what the numbers that we're counting on coming from Gaza are provided by the health ministry, which is controlled by Hamas. I will take with a grain of salt anything a terror organization is saying, especially when they include their own terrorists within the numbers. And I'm not, that is to say that we are sorry for any civilian lives that are lost.
Isn't it impossible to protect a civilian population when you're bombing from the air and attempting to hit targets which you claim are maybe Hamas centers of control? But we see streets flattened. You know, the entire street cannot be used by Hamas as a control center, yet we see an entire street flattened. Why?
That is the challenge that we are facing with, and that is the challenge of the people in Gaza under Hamas rule. Hamas has embedded itself so much within its population because they are using them as human shields. And when we say that they're using them as human shields, that means placing the rocket sites next to hospitals, next to schools, next to buildings, and also not letting them evacuate. We call and we ask people to evacuate because we don't want to see casualties. These are horrible images that we're seeing. And I think the accountability and blame needs to be returned to Hamas. People are forgetting that the horrible situation in Gaza right now has one sole name, and that is Hamas.
Have you fallen into the Hamas trap? In other words, when Hamas did what they did with the atrocity in terms of killing so many Israeli people in the kibbutzim, in the Rock Festival and beyond, they knew the way Israel typically has retaliated to any kind of incursion or attack. So they knew the extent of what might happen. And this was the object of the exercise, to create martyrs in Gaza, which the world then would see, and the world would sympathize with Palestinians rather than with Israel. And that's pretty much what has happened.
We're doing right now in Gaza, it's not retaliation. Our aim at this war is to regain security on our borders, which we've lost, and people are still trying to infiltrate, to bring back our people, and to make sure that we don't have that terror threat on our doorsteps. I think, in a sense, what we see in media coverage and different narratives that people are saying, we all fell into that trap of Hamas, because right now nobody's talking about the accountability of Hamas, but everybody's blaming Israel for
But
different
isn't that
things.
the point, that they knew this? And I was going to go back in history with you, because Menachem Begin, who became prime minister of your country, prior to the setting up of the Israeli state, he was actually labelled a terrorist for what he was doing. He was bombing police stations. He even killed an Anglo-Irishman, one of the Guinness family, and the theory was that the British would react in such a violent way that their bombing and their offences would be forgotten as compared to what the British would do in retaliation. And so it turned out. And ultimately, Menachem Begin became, as I say, prime minister of your country, a respected leader, political leader in your country. Hamas are simply taking that lesson of history and waiting for you to react, as the British did, so that the world would sympathize with them. And that's what's happening.
I beg to differ on that analogy. And I know, especially here in Ireland, with the history of fighting power that controls you, like we experienced in Israel. And I think the horizon of a political future and political talk is something that we both countries can understand. Hamas charter tells it very literally, and I don't know why the world is not reading it to understand. They call on killing of Jews and Israelis, and they say that they will not, that agreeing to any negotiations on conversations is against Islam. That is in the Hamas charter. If they say so, I think we should believe them. And I think in that sense, it's the responsibility on all of us, of media, elected officials, to make sure that we hold them accountable.
In terms of the number of people who would support Hamas politically in Gaza, what proportion of the population would you say that is?
I'm afraid that we can't know of anything that is truly happening in Gaza. We can't know the numbers of people affected. We've seen with the hospital tragedy, the amount of lies that came out on that horrible tragedy when Islamic Jihad misfired that mislaunch of the rocket. It hit the hospital. They blamed Israel. The world was so quick to blame Israel. And right now, when it's evident that it's Islamic Jihad responsible, it's evident that the numbers are wrong. It's also evident that Hamas has stockpiles of food and fuel and water. So there is no way of knowing what is going on there. And people are not allowed to talk or even move freely.
But the suspicion that you might have is that what proportion of the population? I mean, would half the population support Gaza? Would Hamas? Would less than half? Because what has happened now is that, you as a country, as a people, have not endeared yourselves to the civilian population in Gaza on foot of what's happened.
Unfortunately, it seems that we care more about the poor population of Gaza.
But are you pushing them into the arms of Hamas? Another generation will be lost to Hamas because of the Israeli actions.
We see the indoctrination that Hamas has within Gaza. And we've called on them, and we're doing our utmost best in order to make sure that there is minimal civilian casualties. But when rockets are still being fired at Israel, when terrorists are still trying to infiltrate, and when our hostages, 220, with babies and women, babies who hadn't have proper nutrition for 18 days now. I don't want to know in which condition. I can't think of which condition they're in. So,
But that is the generality for many of the people of Gaza. And not just the hostages, but ordinary people who were told by Israel to flee their homes, to head for the Egyptian border, to get out of Gaza City. where were they to go without nutrition, without water, without fuel?
They're to go to southern Gaza Strip. We're making a separation between the city of Gaza and south of the Gaza Strip, where there is more water and more humanitarian aid. We know that Hamas has stockpiles of fuel, water, food. Why isn't the world talking about that responsibility? The same way that Israel
presumes, by the way, they have stockpiles for themselves, for their own activities.
They have
not
much
for the
more
general
than
population.
what they have much more from what they need. Israel, because out of our responsibility and duty, we have evacuated people from our southern front and our northern front because we care. We understand that this is an active combat zone, and we asked people to evacuate. And this is what we're doing with the population in Gaza. We do not want to see them get hurt. We understand the cynical abuse that Hamas is taking of its own population.
But the problem is that they move and they can see across the Rafah crossing into Egypt, they can see the trucks lined up, and a tiny handful of trucks have gotten through because it's normally to feed the population of Gaza. And when you think of Gaza, it's basically a very large refugee camp that depends on world aid to survive. They have no means of supporting 2.5 million people in such a tiny area. They can't produce enough food for themselves, and so on and so forth. So they are depending on aid, and there they are. Many of them have got themselves close to the Egyptian border. They're looking at the aid trucks, and they're not coming in, except in a trickle.
Already in the second aid that passed yesterday were over 50 trucks. And as we all know, Hamas has money. Hamas leadership is very rich. And a lot of people know that. The international community knows that. Media knows that when we're talking about the situation of the population in Gaza. And I understand the people in Ireland feel so strongly about it. What I'm surprised is that there is no outcry about the responsibility of Hamas. Help us stop Hamas and free the Palestinians in Gaza from Hamas.
Why do you think that is so? When, as we talked at the beginning about the extent of the atrocity committed by Hamas a couple of weeks ago, why do you think that is so readily forgotten by the world? What is it about the state of Israel that allows people to concentrate on its wrongdoing rather than on the wrongdoing of Hamas?
For 18 days now, since those horrible attacks happened on October 7th and the fighting ever since, we've seen a solidarity and a show of solidarity from international leaders from different countries in the world. And I understand that in Ireland is different. We see it as an unconscious bias against Israel. And you have much more experience and knowledge than me. I've only been here for 2 months. Then maybe you can help me understand.
But we have a lower level, it seems, of anti-Semitism in Ireland than they do in much of the rest of Europe. So it's not anti-Semitic as such. It is, you can be against the government of Israel while actually liking Israelis.
Why is there a separation between Hamas? And we can make that separation even with the people who butchered us. We make that separation between Hamas and the Palestinian population. And here it seems that Israel in general, there is no separation between government or people. I'll beg to differ about anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, we've seen from my conversations so far with Jewish community, there is concern to speak out. There is concern to raise your voice. You don't need to be pro-Israel, but even people who want to balance the conversation, because there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation being spread, or biases or myths that are spread, and people are afraid to talk. So that is a form of anti-Semitism. If you delegitimize the existence of Israel, then yes, that is...
I don't think anyone is, generally speaking in the conversation, saying that Israel has no right to exist. Now, the birth of Israel, as we know, did lead to the dispossession of people. And maybe there's something in our DNA about England planting settlers here in Ireland and taking land. Maybe there's an element of that. But the expansion of the settlements by Israel in the West Bank, for instance, I mean, these are not, tents. These are cities or large towns. And people are wondering, how long can this go on? Because there will be no peace unless the settlements are removed.
There are three parts to your question. First of all, we've seen in demonstrations and we've seen different elected officials call from the river to the sea. And that phrase means no Israel. That means that there is no Israeli Jewish state. So yes, that is delegitimizing Israel. In the end of the British Mandate, which, as you know, also ruled Israel, when we established Israel, the Palestinians had an opportunity to establish a Palestinian state. Instead, there was a war against us, not just, from all Arab countries around us. So that was an opportunity. There were other opportunities throughout history. There was the Oslo Accords. There was the disengagement from Gaza in 2005, since we don't longer hold Gaza and we're not responsible for Gaza. In order to have peace, we've shown that we will give land. So I think time and time again, Israel has shown that if there is a viable chance, even just a remote chance for peace and to live in peace with our neighbors, we will do whatever we can.
Yeah. At the moment, that looks very far away, because I can only think that the bombing in Gaza, to an extent of hundreds of raids overnight for several nights, that is only going to alienate a population that you're going to try to make peace with.
Right now, I don't think peace is a word that we can use with reference to Hamas. And
how will you know that you've rooted out all of Hamas, if that's what the objective of the current military operation, which is bombing at the moment and some small incursions, but the prospect of a ground invasion? How will you know? Because many of them will find a way to get themselves to Lebanon or to other third countries.
We need the international community's help on this, because in order to destroy this terror organization, this is something bigger than Israel. But right now, all the targets that we are hitting in Gaza are military targets. And we've seen operative and leaders, one after the other, that we are trying to eliminate. Yet, rockets keep on going on Israel. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because still here in Ireland, people forget about it. People might...
You do have the Iron Dome technology from the United States. They don't have any such thing in Gaza. And I don't know...
What? I'm sorry. We need to ask why, and I'm sorry for cutting you. If they have so much money for their rockets, for their tunnels, for their infrastructure, they could have invested that money differently.
And this is a question, by the way, we've raised on this program. If you got money for thousands of rockets, that money might have been spent doing other things. But when I see the images that are coming out of Gaza, and I don't think it's fake to see 3 men carrying 3 children to their grave, 15 people in one family, going into what effectively is a mass grave. These are not fake images of dead children.
No, these are horrible, horrible images. Our hearts are with the Palestinian population in Gaza. They are held hostages by Hamas. So it is okay to be pro-Palestinian. You don't need to be pro-Israeli, but help the Palestinian population from Hamas. Hamas needs to be stopped.
Now, you criticized President Higgins. You called his comments inflammatory. His spokespeople have replied saying that he condemned violence on all sides, including the actions of Hamas.
It is not my place. I am a visitor here to criticize or
But you did. You called his comments inflammatory.
Part of our work as diplomats representing Israel is also to make sure that when different misinformation is or things that are not factual being discussed, then yes, we need to counter that. And there are a lot of misconceptions about international law and the use of international law. And Israel is committed and abiding by international law and the rules of war.
Do you believe that the blockade preventing food and water and fuel getting into the population of Gaza, you believe that that is in accordance with international law, to blockade a civil population like that?
It's not something that I think, but this is our legal analysis and knowledge that has based it. every act that we do, we make sure that it abides by international law. So yes, when you are in a war, and this is based on the rules of law that, again, we are committed to, Hamas is not, you are allowed to stop your enemy from any equipment they might need. You need to make sure that the population gets the humanitarian aid, and this is what we've been doing with the trucks. Is anybody taking care of the hostages?
Going in and make sure that there's nothing that could be misused in those trucks.
Yes, and that is what we've done. 50 trucks went
in their hundreds, not in their 20s.
Well, it takes time to make sure that everything is okay and they're not abusing. And Hamas doesn't take that equipment. Unfortunately, time and time again, we use them take that equipment from their own people and just abuse them for their purposes.
But we are, as they say, where we are, with a civilian population hugely on the move, perhaps 500,000 or more people on the move without adequate sustenance. And the only way they can't get in through the Israeli borders, so the only way they can get any kind of relief is through the Egyptian crossing.
Just one remark that they can't get in from the Israeli border because one of the first things that Hamas did was blow up the Erez crossing, which is where humanitarian aid usually goes through.
But it wouldn't be coming in now anyway, would it? Because you're operating an effective blockade.
Not effective, legal blockade. And that is what a lot of people are repeating here, not understanding the legal aspects of it.
Now, you were saying that you believe that our president was inaccurate or misleading in some way?
I hear a lot in the Irish media or by elected officials that what Israel is doing is not legal. And this is what I'm emphasizing. We are, and I just had another conversation with our legal advisor, who is one of the world's legal experts on all of this. And yes, what we are doing is abiding by international law. We are letting humanitarian aid go in. 50 trucks went in. When actually nobody makes sure of our population. It's tiny. Hamas has stockpiles of whatever the population needs. Let's point that finger at Hamas. They are responsible for the population. Why is it that we, as Israel, and you here in Ireland, spend hours worrying about the population when they just cynically abuse that?
But you can't believe, really, that Hamas would have sufficient stockpiles of food and water and fuel to feed and care for an entire population of over 2 million people.
It sounds absurd, I know, because one in a logic mind in the Western free world cannot comprehend. But yes, Hamas, the same organization, terror organization that controls Gaza, has enough stockpiles for them, for other population. They could have used the fuel that they had for the hospital. They could have used the fuel for the water pumps. They could have used all of what they have for the benefit of their people.
Now, the level of opposition is growing in your own country. The failure to protect the population is seen as a massive intelligence failure, but also the opposition to the current, there's a government of national unity operating at the moment, but the Netanyahu government prior to this outrage, the opposition to that is very significant.
What we've seen since October 7th is the solidarity, the amazing solidarity of the Israeli people and everybody coming together. Jewish people around the world
said that they attribute blame to Mr. Netanyahu himself.
Right now, we are united in this war. And we've seen it not just in the government, but with the army and the population. We are all in this together because we understand that this is an existential threat.
And the going back to the whole question of a war crime, on this program, when we saw the carpet bombing by Russia of Ukraine and so on, we condemn that as a war crime. And it's very difficult for some people to distinguish what's different about what Israel is doing in Gaza City, literally razing the place to the ground, compared to what the Russians did in Ukraine and some of the southern cities there.
I don't think there is any room for comparison. When Israel decides which target to hit in Gaza, that is a military target of Hamas. This is just something that we choose lightly, and we make sure how how much population is there at all, if we will take out that attack or not. But any attacks we've done so far, any target is a military target and therefore legal by international law. If
So
you are
whether or
being
not children die, they are the collateral damage to what you believe is a legal act.
Unfortunately, and it's horrible to talk about it, these are human lives what we're talking about. But this is the same reason that Hamas builds their headquarters and launch sites from so close within its population. I agree with you. This is horrible. But right now, we need to attack those targets because this is where we're being attacked from. And according to international law, if you are attacked from a target, even if it's a school or a UN organization, you are allowed to defend yourself and retaliate.
Do you believe that the EU draft statement calling for a pause in the hostilities will be effective, will be listened to by Israel?
I don't think we are the question right now. Hamas started this war unprovoked on October 7th. Right now, rockets are still being fired at Israel. If we lay down our weapons, who can guarantee that Hamas doesn't continue these attacks?
Dana Ehrlich, Israeli ambassador to Ireland, thank you very much for joining us in studio today.
Thank you.